Welcome, everybody. Got a great event for you tonight. I'm the presiding officer and the treasurer for the Skwim Club. My name is Jeff Clinton. I'm going to get us started by reading our mission statement. The mission of our Toastmaster Club is to provide a mutually supportive and positive learning environment in which every member has the opportunity to develop communication and leadership skills, which in turn foster self-confidence and personal growth. Really happy we got so many guests tonight. Wish we could take the time to greet you all in person, have you introduce yourselves. Our Vice President of Membership, Ayushi Rai, will have a guest book in the chat. If you could sign that, enter your information. We'd be glad to hear more about you. Thank you. But enough about me. I'm going to turn this over to our star Toastmaster of the evening, Leobov. Would you take it away?
Oh, thank you, Jeff. And hello, everyone, and welcome to the storytelling workshop. Today we have a guest who can make a trip to the post office sound like an adventure in Jurassic Park. If you've ever thought that your life too ordinary for a great story, just wait until our guest shows you that even an abandoned spoon in a pile of leaves can be the hero of a story. So buckle up and get ready to turn your whoops moments into your wow stories. Please join me in welcoming the best-selling author, award-winning teacher, 60-time Moth Story Slam winner, and 9-time Grand Slam champion, Matthew Dix. Hello, Matthew. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Matthew, for joining us. And this late hour, I know in your time zone it's late. And I need to tell you, you've completely reshaped how I think about storytelling. And I first discovered this in your book, Storyworthy. Here you go. I've discovered the moth. And it hooked me instantly. And here's my observation. Every time I go, I see the same people who keep dropping their names into the hat. And then they get on stage and their voices shaking and their hands trembling. But they keep dropping their names into the hat. And the nerve it takes to step up and overcome the biggest, I repeat, the biggest fear of humanity, public speaking, just to share a story. Here's my question. What makes us to tell stories?
Oh, well, it's a great question, actually. There's a bunch of things, but I always tell people, let's start with evolution. Let's start with the idea that for all of human history, with the exception of the last 1/4% of our existence on this planet, the only way that we could communicate information from one generation to the next was through storytelling. And it's kept us alive. Realistically, there are animals that should have eaten us a long time ago. We are slower than a lot of them and weaker than a lot of them, but it is only our ability to communicate and sort of learn from the previous generation that allowed us to essentially take over the planet. But for most of that time, the communication was done orally through oral storytelling. And because of that, our brains have evolved in such a way that when we hear someone begin to tell a story, like really remarkable things happen inside our brains. Our brains are signaled to understand that a story might keep us alive. Now, today, that's probably not the case, right? We have doors and Doritos. We have ways of keeping alive that don't necessarily need a story, but our brains still believe that. So if I begin telling you a story, chemicals get released into your brain immediately that I sort of biohack you in a way that really help me. Oxytocin gets released, which makes you feel closer to me, more connected to me. Endorphins get released that make you feel better about the space you're in. And there's actually a chemical that gets released that improves comprehension and memory. So everything that I'm going to say to you will be better remembered and understood. So there's many, many ways to answer the question you just asked, but I always think the first and foremost reason is if you're telling a story, you're going to cause people to be predisposed to like you, want to listen to you, and understand you. So to not tell a story strikes me as silly, a waste of an opportunity that really costs nothing. So that is, ultimately the first reason I think when I'm trying to tell a story is I'm going to change brain chemistry in my favor.
And I have a story for you. Yesterday, I invited my home club members to this event, and I mentioned your name and Bill. We have Bill here. Bill said, like, I can't recall. And then I said, like, he's the guy who told us a spoon story. And then he said, yeah, now I remember this guy. That's how we remember people, by stories they share with us. Okay, now we've got everything settled. It's time to dive into the heart of tonight's meeting. And just a quick reminder for everyone, please type your questions and reactions in the chat. Keep your mic off and enjoy the show. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So it was an interesting question to open with, and I appreciated it. It was a good one. I'm often asked by many people why we're telling stories. I started telling stories for the reasons that were described. I used to go to the Moth. Back in 2011, I went to New York City to tell my first and what I thought would be my last story. I'll go and tell one story, check that off the list, and never return. And it changed my life that night. And for a long time, I thought the reason I would tell stories was for the reasons to entertain. My plan was I'll stand on stages, I'll make people laugh, I'll make them cry. I really enjoy doing that, and I thought that would be my life for a long time. And I honed my craft, and I, started teaching it and wrote a book about it, and then wrote another book about it. But eventually, a couple years into my career, I was traveling the country and performing. And one evening, I was at a synagogue. I was performing a benefit show. I told about an hour's worth of stories. And then later on, during the reception, I was eating cookies and drinking some punch. And a man came up to me named Boris, and he said, I want you to help me with my company. I need to tell better stories. And I told Boris, I don't do that. I just sort of entertain people on a stage. I make them laugh and cry. And he said, no, you are incorrect. You can help me very much. And I did not believe Boris, but I have a foundational philosophy that I say yes to every opportunity, knowing that eventually it could become a no if necessary. And so I agreed to have lunch with Boris. And about 10 minutes into our conversation, I realized that I was wrong and Boris was right, that he was telling not so good stories about his business and I could help him. So Boris became my first client. He remains my longest client because he is still my client today. But today I have the pleasure of working with companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Adobe and Google and large companies and startups. I work with the FBI these days. I help their hostage negotiation unit. I teach them how to tell stories because if someone has barricaded themselves behind a door and they've kidnapped someone and it's the worst day of their life and the worst day of their victim's life, it turns out that if you can tell them a story and connect with them, biohack their brain, and get them to feel more connected to you and maybe get them to tell a story too, those situations can actually resolve more positively more often. So whether it is a priest, a minister, or a rabbi, or a company, or a nonprofit, or an FBI agent, all of these folks have figured out that storytelling is a very powerful and meaningful way to communicate. It allows us to connect to people in a way, entertain people in a way, and I think fundamentally that is almost the most important reason we want to tell stories. I'm often surprised when I'm working with anyone really who does public speaking, a keynote speaker, a product manager, a CEO, anybody. It often interests me how often people think that simply because we're on stage or we're standing at the front of the boardroom or the front of a classroom or anywhere, that just because we have the microphone or we have the floor, that anyone wants to hear anything we have to say. I think the best storytellers, the best public speakers in the world have a foundational, fundamental, at our core belief that no one wants to hear anything we have to say unless we give them a reason to listen. And quite frankly and honestly, I'm assuming right now that none of you have any interest in me whatsoever. You have nothing to do with me in any way unless I give you a reason to listen. I kind of assume that my audience is filled with terrible people at all times. And to be totally honest, I assume you're all terrible people. And the only way I can get terrible people to listen to me is to find a way to convince them I have something to offer. And sometimes that can be immediately actionable information, which I hope to give you tonight so that you can walk away and be a better storyteller. But sometimes I think it's just entertaining by connecting, by telling a story that you'll remember a year later, right? So the idea that you might remember my spoon story that I told months and months ago does not surprise me. I can remember movies from when I was 10 years old with almost perfect clarity. I can remember books that I read as a teenager, and I can sort of recite the plot exactly to you. But I cannot tell you the contents of the keynote at my high school graduation or my college graduation. I can't tell you the last pie chart I saw. I can't tell you the last pitch deck that I went through or the last presentation because none of them contained stories. But when we embed a story into what we're doing, we immediately become more memorable. So, regardless of what you are speaking about, regardless of where you are speaking, regardless of the format, I believe that telling a story is the wisest and best thing that any public speaker can do. I've had the honor of working with a lot of Toastmasters people over the years. I've actually coached some folks up into the higher echelons of competition. I don't have a champion yet, but I have sort of semifinalists under my belt. And I can tell you that all of them have come to me with the singular goal of I need to do a talk, but I need to embed a story within that talk so that I can separate myself, so I can become memorable, so people will hear me, appreciate me, and overcome that fundamental belief that nobody wants to hear anything you have to say unless you give them a reason to listen. So I thought I'd give you some examples on how I help folks leverage storytelling, not necessarily in sort of the moth entertaining stories that I tell on the stage, but in the work that we do, whether you're a keynote speaker or you are a business person looking to place a story somewhere into the work that you're doing. I thought I'd offer you a few examples of how that works in my everyday practice. Maybe I'll give you a few strategies that you can begin using immediately to tell a better story. And then I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to challenge you to sort of do something in storytelling that might help you in the future. But let me give you some examples because every single day I sit at this desk in this chair and I work with business people and speakers. And I mean, just today, if I think about the people I worked with, I started at 6 a.m. I worked with someone in Idaho who runs a business, who owns a company, which is kind of crazy because 6 o'clock at my time is 4 a.m. in Idaho time, but that's the only time we can ever sort of get together. So I met with a guy who owns a business in Idaho. He's looking to tell better stories to help his business. I went off to school because I'm still an elementary school teacher. I worked with 10-year-olds today. Took them on a field trip, which is a disaster. It's the worst thing a teacher can ever do. Don't ever think we like it, we hate it. But by the time I got home, I worked with a financial manager in Los Angeles who just lost his home in the Palisades, but is still looking to tell better stories and actually looking to at least leverage the tragedy that he suffered into stories he might be able to better use in the work that he's doing. And then I met with a minister who's working on an important sermon in May that he has to deliver, and I'm helping him with that sermon. I cooked dinner for my family. We ate dinner, and then I had a very brief meeting with a longtime client at a very large company that I cannot mention, but someone who sort of needed me to help them refine a pitch for something that they're doing tomorrow. So all of those folks, although all of them came to me with different purposes, they were all using story to help them move forward. And that isn't to say that they're always telling a full and complete story like my spoon story, but they're leveraging the strategies of storytelling. So they're making sure that even if they're not telling a story, they're embedding stakes and suspense and surprise into the work that they're doing. They're adding humor. And if they're not naturally funny people, I can teach people how to be funny because there are no naturally funny people. Humor is nothing but a collection of strategies deployed in a certain way, in a certain tone perhaps, that cause people to laugh. And so you can learn how to be funny. We talked about the chronology, meaning the order that the thing is going to be told in. All of these things, whether you're telling a story or not, can be leveraged in a talk. So let me just give you a few examples of the things that I do with people. I work with a biotech company in Boston. They do a lot of things, but I was working with 5 scientists who were going to a conference, and their goal was to report on the science they were doing at their company in order to gather sales leads. They were hoping to have people in the conference call the company and essentially start buying their stuff. I was working with all 5 scientists, helping them to embed stories in the work that they were doing. One scientist in particular, though, embraced storytelling like none other. His name was John. So John was charged with speaking about a product that his company produced. Essentially, it was tubes. I can't explain it completely, but they manufacture these tubes that are used in experimental processes around the world. And all of John's competitors sell one kind of tube. And essentially, you buy that tube and retrofit it to your particular needs. John's company sells about 18 different kinds of tubes, shapes and sizes, so there's no retrofitting required. But John's tubes are a lot more expensive than the competitors. So you can buy the cheap tubes and retrofit them, or buy John's expensive tubes and have exactly what you need. So I'm talking to John, and we're looking for a story to tell. And this is essentially what John comes up with. I'll tell a not so good version of John's story. John takes the stage on the day of the conference, and he says, every Saturday, I have to go grocery shopping, and I hate every minute of it. My family creates lists for me through the week, but they can't create one list because they're awful people. So my son scratches things he wants on a piece of paper and hands it to me. My wife just texts me throughout the week everything we need, one text at a time. So I have to collate all those texts into a list. And my daughter sends me an email. So it starts with an hour-long process of just bringing the list together and then going to the store. And he said, the first moment I walk in the store is the worst because I'm faced with the apples, that large table of apples in the produce section. He says his family can't agree on apples. His son likes Cosmic Crisp, this weird new kind of apple that's difficult to find. His daughter likes Yellow Delicious, which is equally ridiculous to find. And his wife needs like 5 different apples every week because she likes variety. And so he has a list of apples. He brings a Sharpie every week, and he has to put them all in these bags and mark on the bags what each one is so his family can figure out what he's bought when he gets home. But then he tells everyone in the audience, he says, our company fundamentally believes in my apples, meaning we believe you should get all of them. He says, our competitors say, here's a Macintosh, make do with it. Doesn't matter what you need, what you want, what you're doing with it. You get one Macintosh and that's it. My company believes you deserve all the apples. You're doing good, hard work, and we're here to help you. John, unlike any of the other scientists, actually presents no data at the scientific conference. All he does is tell a better version of the story I just told you, and he leaves the stage. 2 weeks later, I get together with the vice president of marketing and the scientists, and we discover that John has more leads than the other 4 scientists combined. Now, the director of marketing is not happy with me because I have sent a scientist to a scientific conference and he told a story about apples and left the stage. She says to me, how can we send scientists to scientific conferences and not present data? I point out to her that now John can present the data because he has the leads that will lead to phone calls, that will lead to the data, which the customers undoubtedly want, but they don't need it initially. What they want is a story that is memorable, that will connect you to the person who's speaking, and will make sense of what you're trying to say. What I told John when we were preparing the story was, it sounds like your company is invested in giving lots of choice to customers. Can you think of a time in your life where you're giving lots of choice to someone? And immediately he said, oh, the damn apples, right? And so his Apple story becomes a huge success. What I have to explain to the director of marketing is not only is it a huge success, but every single person in that conference, the next time they're in a grocery store and they're facing that tray of apples, they're thinking about John, his company, with positive associations. We're creating these like monoliths of stories that exist in the world when we tell honest to goodness, real stories that are relatable to other people. So it is a story and then a pivot to the business that allows John to achieve this goal. Eventually, to the director of marketing's credit, she agrees with me. But I understand her problem because for 20 years, she's been sending scientists to scientific conferences to present data, and I am essentially upending her means of business, right? I'm telling her she's kind of been doing it wrong. Essentially, what I'm telling her is nobody's telling stories, so you should be telling stories. And that is what storytelling comes down to. Most people in most places are not telling stories in the way they need to. So if you can, it's an easy differentiator. Whether you are competing in a Toastmasters competition or trying to sell something or delivering a sermon from the pulpit or just trying to get your kid to stop being stupid. When you can tell a story, people are more likely to remember you, feel good about what you said, and follow through. All right, example number 2. I'm working with Dave. He's a contract manager at Amazon. He's got a whole team of attorneys. And Amazon is beginning to offshore all of their design and products to other companies. And so, because they're doing that, the attorneys need to start writing much more specific contracts. The contracts have to be exact. In the words of Dave, if we don't tell the company what to do precisely, they're not going to do it. So he has to meet with his attorneys, a 90-minute meeting, and he recognizes right away, I need to be more entertaining than I typically am. So he comes to me. I want to tell some stories, he tells me. So we identify the theme of the day, which is specificity. He wants to reinforce specificity with his attorneys. So I asked Dave, where in your life are you either overly specific or you wish you had been overly specific? And Dave says, I don't know. Now, Dave's frustrating to me because he's not really a storyteller. He's a Band-Aid person. I like to think that I work with brick people and Band-Aid people. Brick people are people who believe in building a wall of stories, a pile, a significant pile, wall of stories that you can harness for the rest of your life. Dave's a Band-Aid guy. He calls me and essentially says, fix my problem. I don't want to engage in the process. I just want you to tell me what to do. So Dave says to me finally, he goes, what story do you have? Do you have any specific stories? I tell him, I have a dozen, Dave, because I'm invested in storytelling, which really means I'm invested in my life. I'm curious about my life. I'm a little self-centered in terms of my life in a positive and productive way. I got lots of stories. He says, give me one. So I said, Dave, if I was in your shoes, this is what I would tell. I would say, I hate pickles. I really do. I hate pickles so much that I kind of hate people who like pickles, and my wife likes pickles. I don't like to be in the room with a pickle. I cannot stand even looking at pickles. And the worst thing about pickles is they're the only food item that is arbitrarily placed on a plate at a restaurant without any warning. I order a hot dog and fries, no mention on the menu of a pickle, but when it arrives, there's a pickle the size of the hot dog right against it. And the other terrible thing about pickles is they're sort of radioactive, meaning if there's a pickle on the plate, everything on the plate will vaguely taste like pickle as well. It makes me crazy. So every time I go to a restaurant, almost regardless of what I order, I always say, and if you're going to throw a pickle on the plate, for reasons I don't understand, please don't. Dave says, I'm going to use that story. I ask Dave, do you hate pickles like me? Dave says, I do now. So Dave steals my story, uses it in a less than, oh, I'm busy, sweetie. Uses it in a, good night. Yeah, good night. See you in the morning. Uses it in a less than authentic way and then uses it at his conference. And it works beautifully. In fact, in the Amazon contract department, at least Dave's department, if there is a contract produced and it does not have enough specificity, he will say there's a pickle on this contract, you need to go fix it. And Dave now understands that because he's told that story, every time one of his attorneys is out at a restaurant and they get an arbitrary pickle on the plate, they're going to think about Dave and specificity. And best of all, they're probably going to tell Dave's story to the people they're having dinner with, which is the greatest thing that can ever happen to a storyteller, which is people begin telling your story to others, right? If you are a person in business, you want people talking about your products and services. If you're a minister, you want people going off and preaching to other people what you have preached. If you're a parent, you want to tell your daughter something and you want your daughter to tell your son something about that later on. Having people tell your story is the greatest achievement of all. And that's what happened for Dave. All right, I will give you one more example. Oh, this is a good one. So I'm working with Troy. Troy is an entrepreneur whisperer of sorts. He built a huge company and he sold it for $1 billion. And what he does today is he has conferences around the country where he brings in entrepreneurs sort of building their businesses for the first time. And he gives them ideas and helps them sort of find their way. So he's having a conference coming up. And at this conference, one of the talks he wants to give is on the idea that sometimes in business, a single solution will cure all your problems. And he has a really good example of it. It turns out that in Facebook's early days, they were failing. People were not sticking with the platform. And so they dug deep into the data and they discovered something really interesting. They discovered that if a person makes 10 connections, connects with 10 friends on the platform, over the course of 10 days, they're likely to stay on the platform. But if they don't find 10 friends in 10 days, they're likely to leave the platform. Which is why today, if you use Facebook, if you log in, the first thing it's going to say is, would you like to add your contact list to Facebook? Which is their attempt to get you 10 contacts as quickly as possible. Here's a friend of a friend. Would you like to have a friend of a friend as well? All of this is designed in the early days of Facebook when they recognize one singular bit of data, which is, oh, this is how we make our platform sticky. I said, that's great, Troy. It's a great story. And he says, but I want a personal one too. And he's right. He needs a personal story. A business story is fine, but you want the person who's actually delivering the message to be telling a story too. Those are the best stories. And so I asked Troy, when in your life did you find a singular solution to a complex problem? Can you think of one? And he hems and haws with me. He hems and haws with me in a way that I know he has a story, but he doesn't want to tell me. I've been doing this for a long time, and I can detect it right away when someone's avoiding a story. So we go back and forth for quite a while, and finally Troy says, okay, I have a story, but I can't use it. And I said, well, tell me what it is. So Troy tells me that about 5 years ago, he was struggling in his marriage with his wife. They had hit the rocks, and they were in marriage counseling. And it didn't look like the marriage was going to survive, and it was breaking his heart. He did not want to lose his wife. And so one day, he's driving with his buddy somewhere, and he finally finds the courage to tell his friend what's going on in the marriage. When he's finished telling his friend says, do you kiss your wife every morning? Like a real passionate kiss? And Troy says, no, I do not. Nobody does that. And his friend says, do it. Every morning, kiss your wife, a real kiss. And he says, that is not going to fix my marriage. It is a lot more complex than that. And he says, just do it. It's not going to cost you anything. So Troy does. Troy starts kissing his wife every morning, a real good kiss. And Troy tells me, I don't know why, but it actually worked. He said somehow that connection that we made every morning allowed us to begin talking in a way we hadn't spoken before. It saved the marriage. And he said today, 5 years later, he has the strongest marriage of anyone he knows. I said, Troy, that is the story you have to tell. And Troy said, I cannot tell that story. He says, I'm not going to stand up in front of 300 entrepreneurs and tell them I had a problem in my marriage and I started kissing my wife and it solved everything. I begged him to tell the story. He did not. But every person listening to me now knows Troy should have told that story. The beauty of it is, just imagine, every time one of those guys is kissing his wife, he's going to think about Troy, which is maybe not the best reason to tell that story, but it is a deeply personal story. And anyone who's had any problems in any relationship whatsoever will immediately empathize and connect with him. He didn't have the courage to do it. And it comes down to courage. It comes down to the willingness to be vulnerable. What Troy didn't understand, and hopefully he will come to understand, is that vulnerability is never a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. It is easy to say nice things about yourself. It is easy to brag. It's easy to talk about your accomplishments. It requires no courage to say good things about yourself. It takes courage to say hard things about yourself. It takes courage to talk about the embarrassing and the humiliating and the failing moments of our lives, at least for some of us. For me, honestly, it requires no courage whatsoever. So never think I am brave. I'm just broken. I'm just willing to share everything at all times. But for most people, it's a real challenge. And Troy has not overcome that challenge yet. But that was the right story to tell. But that's the idea that when I talk about storytelling, sometimes I'm talking about it to entertain. Sometimes I'm talking about it to make people laugh and then make people cry, which is my favorite thing to do. But a lot of times, what I'm doing with stories is I'm using them as a means of accessing or gaining access to an idea to bring an audience from one place to another. If I want to teach someone a principle or an idea, or convince them I am correct, or introduce a new concept to them, rather than saying, here is what I want you to believe, I instead say, I'm going to get them to believe in something in a realm entirely unlike the realm I need to occupy, right? I want them to believe in this, but I'm going to get them to believe in that same principle, but over here in an entertaining way. I'm going to get them to believe that specificity is really important when it comes to ordering food, especially if you hate pickles. And people are going to nod and laugh and say, yes, specificity is important. And once we get agreement on that, I slide it over to contracts, and it almost becomes undeniable. We take it from the entertaining, amusing, unforgettable realm, and we bring it into the boring realm. But by bringing that joy and that humor and that relatability and that unforgettableness into the boring realm of contracts, suddenly it doesn't quite feel like that. It feels a little more understandable, a little more relatable, a little more memorable, and a little more fun to talk about. It's what I call speaking with adjacency, which means I'm going to speak about the thing without speaking about the thing. I'm going to match the theme, meaning, and message of something, get people convinced that that is what they should believe, and then slide it over to the area I need to access. It's simple and complex, but people can master it very effectively. I'm working with this former NBA player right now, and actually a former Olympian on the Nigerian Olympic team. He's a financial analyst, and he was telling me a story today. He was telling me a story about his two kids. He's got a boy and a girl, and they're both riding scooters. And they're riding scooters down this very steep hill. And his son is riding down the steep hill and not slowing down. So when he gets to the bottom, he flies out and wipes out every time. And he's watching his son just sort of wipe out on the ground and skin his knees. And he's thinking, you'll eventually learn your lesson, buddy. His daughter, meanwhile, is flying down that hill with the same speed, but as she comes to the bottom, she's braking and slowing down so that she can coast to a halt, right? He's watching that just the other day and he says, Matt, here's what I'm going to do. I've been working with him for a while. He says, I need to talk about the philosophy of our investment company. Most companies, or a lot of companies, believe in my son's version of investment, which is hard charging. We're going to make some mistakes along the way, but we're going to go for it. We're going to go for the gold every single time. That's not our company. He says our company believes in aggressive but safe when it comes to handling your money, right? We're going to charge as hard as we can, but we're not going to wipe out because that is your life savings. That is your retirement. We're not going to mess with it. We're not going to go for the gold medal. We're actually going to go for the silver medal because we're dealing with your money. And isn't the silver medal better than the gold medal if it's a safer bet? He said, what do you think? Using my kid's story, I said, you got it. Like, you figured it out. 4 sessions in, he's already starting to do it. And he's picking out stories from his life that are relatable. The beauty of that story is he gets to say his kids' names. He gets to identify himself as a father. He gets to identify himself as a father who's willing to allow his son to wipe out at the bottom of the hill again and again and again to learn a lesson, which makes me admire him as a teacher. Like, good job. Lessons are sometimes hard won, right? All of that. And he's doing it so simply and so easily. That's why we want to tell stories. So that is the way we deploy stories when we're not trying to simply entertain, when we're not trying to make people laugh and cry, when we're not trying to make people want to come back to the theater the next day to see us again. So I'd like to give you a few tips on how to tell a better story. some things that you can begin to do already as soon as you're done here to tell stories in a more meaningful way. I'm going to try to fit in 3 in the next 25 minutes. I think I can pull it off. All right. So first, let's start with the beginning of a story because it's the most important part. I used to tell people that the beginnings and the endings of stories were equally valuable, equally important. I no longer believe that. The problem is this. The ending of a story is critical, but the beginning of the story is where you convince people to listen to you or ignore you. If we compare a story to a plane ride, right, we're going to take our audience to a beautiful location. If the plane is empty, it does not matter where I land that plane. I can land that plane in the most beautiful place on the planet, but if no one's on my plane, the flight is irrelevant. And when I watch people speak, storytellers, keynotes, all hands, all of these things, if you don't prioritize the first things that come out of your mouth, people will disengage. You have to give them a reason to listen. So endings are almost as important as beginnings, but beginnings are more important. So I fundamentally believe in paying a lot of attention to the beginning of a story to ensure you land it in the right place. The simplest thing you can do, a strategy I teach 10-year-olds every year to remarkable effect, is to start every story you tell for the rest of your life with 2 things. Location, where are you? And action, what are you doing? That may seem obvious, but if you start to pay attention to the way people tell you stories in life, none of them begin with these things. People begin with exposition. They like to teach you things before they start telling the story. Or they like to say ridiculous things like, guess what? At which point I always think, no, thank you. I'm not playing a guessing game with you. Or they start with, this is a hilarious story, which now has undermined everything they're going to say after that because it's never going to meet that expectation. We start with location and action. My spoon story begins with, I'm standing on a playground behind my school in front of a pile of fall leaves. We start with location because locations are imbued with 1,000 adjectives. I love locations because they allow the movie to begin playing in the mind's eye immediately. As a storyteller, I am not interested in verisimilitude. I don't want you to see the playground behind my school with any clarity. What I want to do is take the playground behind a school that already exists in your brain and steal that one because you can already see that one. And you will see that one better than any playground I attempt to describe, right? If I tell you I'm standing in a kitchen holding a bowl of blueberries in my hands, you can now see that kitchen. You can tell me if the floor is wood, linoleum, or tile. It's probably your own kitchen, or maybe your parents' kitchen or a kitchen you see on television, but you can see it with perfect clarity. You can tell me whether the appliances are laminate or stainless steel. You can tell me, is this one of those weird kitchens where they take the trash can and they hide it under the sink as if it doesn't exist? Or is this a regular, sane kitchen where you can see the trash can and access it easily, right? All of these things come from me saying, I'm standing in a kitchen holding a bowl of blueberries. If I ask you about the bowl, by the way, you can tell me about that too. Is it glass? Is it wooden? Is it plastic? Are the blueberries those beautiful large summer strawberries or those sad little winter strawberries? You can tell me all of that because storytellers leverage nouns that already exist in the minds of our audiences. I like words like kitchen and bowl and blueberry because I don't have to use an adjective. People often ask me, how do you make stories seem so vivid in our minds? And I say, I don't use adjectives. I steal the things that already exist in your brain and I use them. And you don't even recognize that I am using them. So location, I am in a place, and then be doing something. Please note, in the 2 examples I gave you, all I'm doing is standing. The action doesn't need to be much, but I got to be doing something. Doing something is the signal that the story has already begun. And it's really important to begin this way because if we want to leverage brain chemistry in the way I've described, We want to tell people's brains as quickly as possible that a story has begun, and that is the best way to do it. Not, I used to live in a little town in the country in Massachusetts, and it had one stoplight and a little candy store. You forget it. I don't need to listen, right? You've given me nothing to care about. But that's how people start stories all the time. Give a location and give action. The third thing you can do to open a story well is to start as close to the end as possible. This is not my rule. I am stealing it from the great Kurt Vonnegut, who argued this for short stories that are written, and I argue for oral stories that are told. Start your story as close to the end as possible. In that spoon story that was referenced earlier, I start the story at the moment the spoon appears in my life. That is as close to the end of that story as I can possibly get. It is the number one change I make in people's stories when they ask me to help them. They invariably start the story too early. The problem is we've been taught at an early age to speak chronologically. And chronologically means start at the top of the hour, start at the beginning of the day, start at the beginning of the meal, rather than start where the story actually begins. I was working with someone who had a real moment happen while on vacation, which is unusual. It's an actual vacation story that should be told. She was in one of those islands, we'll say Aruba, and something happened during dessert while they were with another couple. Dessert was served, and then something happened that was actually story worthy. Her story began with, so we decided to go to this restaurant, which is completely irrelevant to the story. The particular restaurant is not relevant in any way. So I said, can you move it closer? And she said, we arrive at the restaurant. I said, is the arrival relevant to the story? No, it's not. Can you start closer? We meet the hostess at that podium. Is the meeting of the hostess? And then I said, is the meal relevant at all? Or did the real moment happen when the chocolate cake hit the table? And she said, that's when things really took off. I said, can the story be, I'm sitting at a table in a restaurant when chocolate cake lands and stuff starts to happen? In fact, the fact that she's in Aruba is also irrelevant. It's really a story about two couples eating chocolate cake and having an argument. And the location, the particular location of the restaurant is also irrelevant. So please don't tell me it's in Aruba. That's just distracting. I don't even need to know that. I need to know you're in a restaurant eating chocolate cake when an argument begins. That is starting a story as close to the end as possible. So try to do those three things. Calculate those three things before you begin speaking. I'm going to give you a location. I'm going to give you some action. And ideally, I'm going to start as close to the end as possible. I can tell you, I teach fifth grade, 10-year-olds this strategy. Within a week, parents call me and they say, how did you turn my child into a storyteller overnight? Literally, the only thing they're doing is starting with location and action. That's it. That's all they're doing. And their parents already are feeling like their kids are storytellers because their kids are now biohacking their brains and they don't even see it. So my students used to come in the beginning of the school year and say, Mr. Dix, this weekend I played soccer. It was on the Cape. We played a tournament. I had to play in 3 games. And I said, forget it. Go away. You're boring me. Now that same kid comes into my classroom and he says, Mr. Dix, yeah, it's 2-2 in the championship game. There's about 5 minutes left and the ball is on my foot. I'm like, all right, I'm all in. Let me hear it. He understands. Location, action, start as close to the end as possible, right? They've all learned it, and you can learn it too. It changes everything about the way we tell stories. And I can tell you, I work with a lot of marginalized people in the corporate world, women, people of color, basically anyone who doesn't look like me. And they have a hard time getting people who look like me to shut the hell up. They have discovered that if I actually begin a story with location and action, people stop talking. It's evolutionary. The brain recognizes a story's being told, and something in the brain says, shut up, this might keep us alive. And if you continue to be entertaining, all the better. So that's how you start a story. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea that you are the cinematographer for every story you tell. And what that means is your eyeballs are the eyeballs of the audience. And if we recognize that we're a cinematographer, meaning we actually have a lens, that allows us to point that lens strategically at what we want. The interesting thing about a lens is that what the lens is not showing is often more interesting than what it does show. The limitation of the lens is what creates suspense. Let me give you an example. I was working with a man who was giving a toast at his sister's wedding, and he wanted to tell a story. So his story opens like this. I'll give you the good version, then I'll give you his bad version. The good version is this, approximately. I'm walking across a field of grass. I'm walking across a field of grass that I have not walked on for the last 4 years. I'm walking alongside another person. Her hand is in my hand. It's my sister. I'm walking across a field of grass and stones and trees with my sister. I'm heading to a place we have not seen for 4 years, and I'm excited about what I'm going to do. There's stones to my left and there's stones to my right. We're on a little gravel pathway now. And finally we come to the stone we have come to see. A gravestone. My mother's gravestone. It's been 4 years since I visited it, but now I have something that I can tell her that I'm proud of, and I can't wait to speak these words. That's essentially the beginning of his story. His original version was this. I go to my mother's gravestone with my sister one day, right? Can you see the difference between the two? One is a lens that begins with grass and trees and a person, and it's a sister, and it's a hand holding, and now it's rocks, and it's a gravestone, and it's his mother's gravestone, and why he's here. A slow reveal, thinking of the camera lens and the idea that what I don't say keeps people wondering. The way I describe it to my students is this. When you're telling a story, essentially you're providing information to your audience, and you have two choices. If you have a bucket of information, you can dump it over their head in one big splash, or you can poke a hole in the bottom of the bucket and let it drip on them. The dripping is better. When it's dripping on them, they're wondering what the hell is going to happen next. When you dump the bucket on them, you've given them everything right away. So, when you think about telling stories, you don't want to have a drone's eye view of your story, meaning you don't want to hover above it and say, I went to my mother's gravestone with my sister one day. That is a drone's eye view. The problem with it is when you say it that way, you give the audience the choice about what to see. They get to pick, and they never pick properly, right? They might look at the stone, or they might look at him, or they might look at the cemetery. They're not looking at the things that matter. Instead of grass, trees, stones, sister, hand holding, all of these things. You control the lens with your eyes, and if you strategically tell the audience what to see, one bit at a time, they're always on their edge of the seat to find out what's going to happen next. What we don't say is oddly more important than what we do say, because what we don't say is what the audience is waiting for next. So don't tip the bucket and dump all the information, but poke a hole in the bucket and allow it to drip slowly on the audience. All right, I have time for one more. I did it. Okay, I'm going to give you one more strategy. So I've given you some beginning strategies, 3 of them. I've given you the idea of suspense, which is a way to hold an audience's attention. The last thing I want to talk about is the chronological structure of stories. It's important. There's different ways to tell stories in terms of chronological structure. The simplest version is telling a story in the order it actually happened. I call these A, B, C stories. You start at the beginning, you end at the end, time flows in one direction. Many stories are told like this. More than half the stories in the world should be told like this. This is an ideal chronological structure when your story does not take place over a long period of time. If your story takes place over 5 minutes, 5 hours, even maybe 5 days, this is a good chronological structure. But not all stories operate like this. Many stories take place over the course of a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And no one wants to hear a 10-year story. So in cases like that, we don't use A, B, C. We instead use either B, A, B, C, meaning we start in the middle, and then we go back to the beginning and work our way back to the middle and then finish the story off. Or occasionally, but rarely, we use C, A, B, C, which means we start at the end and then we finish at the end. That one, the CABC, only works if the ending of your story is sort of so thought-provoking and extraordinary that people can't wait to get to the end to find out how this all happened. I begin a story in a CABC fashion that begins like this. I'm standing in the broom closet in the basement of a police station in Bourne, Massachusetts. There's no light in this closet, so I'm in the dark. No one knows I'm in this closet except for the 3 police officers on the other side of the door. I'm standing in the closet and I'm getting ready to confess to a crime I did not commit. That's the beginning of that story. I feel that that's enough thought-provoking wonder that makes people want to get back to the end. The next sentence says, I first came to this police station 3 weeks ago. And essentially the story works me all the way back into the broom closet and explains how did I get in a broom closet in the basement of a police station and why I'm about to confess to a crime I didn't commit, right? But unless you have an ending like that, that one doesn't work. But the BABC works quite well. BABC works well when your story takes place over a long period of time or the beginning of your story is boring. Sometimes stories have boring beginnings, and rather than using the boring beginning, move into the story, find something interesting to start with, and then backstory. The best example I have for this is the movie Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump begins with a 40-year-old man sitting on a bench with a box of chocolates. And then someone sits next to him, and he tells that person the story of his childhood. And then that person gets on a bus and leaves, and another person sits down, and he tells the story of his experiences in football. And then that person leaves. It's actually a BABABABAC story. In truth, Forrest Gump is minutes away from meeting his child that he doesn't know exists and his future wife. That's actually where the story begins. It takes us a long time to actually get there. But what the writers of that movie understood was if we start when Forrest Gump is 5 and we end when he's 55, that feels really long. Instead, let's create something thought-provoking. Why is a man on a bench with a box of chocolates waiting for a bus? What has happened that has brought him to this place? The backstory, why we're going into the past, will eventually explain why we're here. And we understand that as an audience, right? That's a better way to tell the story. So if you think about the stories you tell, what you want to ask yourself simply is this. Is my story taking place over a short period of time? You should probably tell it chronologically. Unless the beginning of your story is kind of boring. Then you should maybe move into the story and find a more interesting place to start. It's called in meter ras. It's the idea that we start in the middle. And then you can ask yourself, do I have such an extraordinary ending to my story that I can actually begin with the ending and then return to finish it off? I can tell you I did some analysis for my last book. About 65% of my stories are told in chronological order, ABC, because that's how people expect stories to be told, about 65%. 30% are told BABC, the Forrest Gump method, and just 5% are told CABC. They're very unusual, but when you find one, it really works well. So consider chronological structure before you begin speaking. I have a million other things I could say about storytelling. But if you just leverage those 3 ideas and start to use even some of them, people will oddly, confusingly, and surprisingly start to say to you things like, boy, you're a really great storyteller. And you might be, but you might also be thinking in your head, all I did was start with location and action. I told the rest of the story the way I've been telling it all my life. Yet somehow now they think I'm a good storyteller. What it really means is they got on your plane this time, right? Before they were not getting on your plane, and this time they did. The movie began playing in their mind's eye because you gave them something to see. And that can make all the difference in the world. All right, so with that said, I did a great job with the time. Good job, Matt. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little challenge. I'm gonna give you an activity that you can do right now, and then we will do as much Q&A as you would like, or until I get tired and go to bed. So, here's my challenge for you. I want you to think of a story that you tell frequently in your life, something that you've told before. It's probably the story that sort of when you start telling it, your spouse or your partner or your children say, "We've heard that one before." Use that one. It's a good one. Something you know. I'm not asking you to craft up a new gem. Take an old chestnut. And I want you to think about the way that story begins. And I want you to find a better way to begin it right now. I want you to think about what the location and action of that story is going to be. And I want you to ask yourself, am I starting in the right place? Am I starting as close to the end as possible? And should I be starting in the middle or maybe even at the end of that story first? Think about it for a minute. And then actually, I'm going to ask you, is it better that we have people unmute and speak, or is it better that we have them put it in the chat, or some combination? What do you think is going to work best for this group?
I think better just to unmute and speak to help.
Great. I like that a lot too. All right. So if you come up with an interesting beginning that is different than the one you've gone with, location, action, as close to the end as possible, and perhaps a new chronological structure, I guess raise your digital hand and we'll have you go one at a time and unmute and give us your beginning, and we will give it a shot. And I guess we're going to start right away. Okay, so raise your digital hand if you would like, but we already have one. Oh, and we have two. Go right ahead.
Okay, Alex, go first. You can go first.
I'm 6 years old. I'm standing on the north shore of Lake Superior in front of an outhouse, abandoned. My parents, my guardians are nowhere to be seen.
That's Alex.
That's
Alex, let me tell you two really great things you did there, and let me ask you one question. So, had I had more time, actually, probably not, because I know that teaching too much stuff at once is a bad idea. But had I gone one step further in the beginning strategies, I would have said create a sense of wonder. In other words, prompt a question in your audience's mind that causes them to want to continue listening, which you did beautifully.
okay.
Right?
I'm
You're 6
hearing
years
radio
old.
chatter from the United States, but I'm in Ontario.
Oh. So, but the idea that you are a small child and that you can't find your parents creates a sense of wonder to me. What has happened? That's fantastic. The other thing you did that was really wise was you gave us your age. Sometimes in a story, we have to give ages because the age is very relevant to a story. Sometimes you don't have to tell your age. If you say something to the effect of last year, everyone can look at me and go, okay, he's a grown-ass man, right? So it depends. If I'm telling a story and I was a teenager at the time, I need to say that because the world is different for me. So that was very good.
Thank you.
The one question I'll say, or the one question I'll ask is Lake Superior, that specificity required for the story?
I think it is.
Okay, that's all. Because if it wasn't, I would say just say a lake, right? Because when you say Lake Superior, what it does is it actually creates a little sense of wonder in my mind.
Right.
Like, oh, why did he identify that lake in particular? If it's relevant to the story, you've done a great job. If
It
it's
is.
not relevant to the story, you've essentially asked me to remember something that will not serve the story well in any way. So we don't want to cognitively load audience members with details that don't pay off eventually. But if
Yeah.
it pays off, brilliant job. Well done, Alex.
No, it's the protagonist. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, well done. Excellent. All right,
Okay.
next.
Iran, I believe. Iran.
That's
Yes,
right.
hello.
That's right. Can I go ahead, Robin?
Iran was first, and
Yeah.
then
Oh, Irene. That's Irene.
Oh, Irene. Yes, it's Irene. Go ahead, Irene.
I was packing with my daughter to go back to France to see my mother. But I don't know how it's gonna be because the last time I saw her, we had a conflict. Is it ever too late to build trust again?
That's very good. Very good, Irene. I would say that I guess the only question I'll ask is where are you while you're packing? Because you didn't give me a location, I put you in your bedroom. Is that useful to you? Or is that accurate?
Well, yeah, because I was actually in Vietnam. So the story will go why I had to go back to France to see my mom.
I see. Yeah. So if you're specific in your location, I won't wonder where you are essentially. So a little more specificity on the location might help. But excellent job. You had that sense of wonder too, which is great. That question causes me to want to know how the story is going to end. Great job.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Kate, you're next, I think.
All right.
Hi, Kate.
Car was silently turning end over the mountain cliff, sit upside down. My sister and my eyes met as we hung upside down in our seatbelts.
Well, that's pretty good. It sounds like you started as close to the end as possible also, which is excellent. Uh, I think most people's inclinations would be to be starting long before the accident happens, and you've already grabbed me with that beginning. Excellent job. Well done. Okay.
Raven, am I right? Raven?
Okay, Robin, that's right. Thank you. I disembarked at San Francisco's International Airport late one night after a long trans-Pacific flight from Hong Kong. Being groggy, I fumbled on my intentions for the visit. This resulted in me being detained at immigration for further questioning. Thank you.
That's excellent. Can I ask, could you start that story with the detention as opposed to the disembarking?
Sure.
Could you push it even further in and start right there instead?
Come again, please.
Sure. I'm wondering, you're stopped by immigration, is that right?
Yes.
Could you start, instead of disembarking in San Francisco Airport, could you start with an immigration officer tells me to step into the room to my left,
Ah, lovely.
right? So that pushes us even further into the story. Probably a more interesting place to begin, too. You can eventually get to the fact you're in San Francisco and it's nighttime, but I would start there instead. Just push it.
Lovely.
Yep.
I get the picture now.
Yeah. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.
We have 4 more. Is it all right? Okay.
Great.
Amy, you go next. Amy?
Okay. I'm sitting in the middle of the last row of a small plane when I hear the pilot's voice come over the intercom. Since we're heading into turbulence, there will be no beverage service. Please keep your seatbelts securely fastened.
Yeah, somehow you managed to make the last row feel very ominous too, which is really great.
It is actually.
Yeah, well done. That was excellent. Bravo.
We're good students. Jim, you go next. Jim.
Hey, you get off the bird feeder, you stupid squirrel. Dumb squirrels anyway.
So let me suggest, I enjoyed your beginning. I typically tell people not to begin with unattributed dialogue in the way you did. I have a sort of a belief, and it's my belief, so take it or leave it. I believe in something called the dinner test, which is the stories that I tell on stage should be a close cousin to the stories I might tell if we were having dinner. And so if my friend said to me, "So how was your day?" and I began with, "Hurry up or pick up your clothes off the floor," my wife yelled. No one would ever have dinner with me again. That would be a weird way to begin a story. So I always worry that unattributed dialogue sort of comes out of left field and is often difficult to process. Like if you give us a place first, then we're prepared for the dialogue as opposed to the dialogue sort of charging in and catching us off guard. So I would use the same language you used, but I would put a location in front of it to sort of prepare me for the fact that a story is about to be told.
What
But
it,
the
where I
sentence
use
itself is excellent.
where I usually would go with this is then to provide context of I've got a great bird feeder in our backyard.
Yeah, I think, and I would just flip it. I would flip it.
Okay.
And so if I said, "How's your day?" You said, "Well, I've got a bird feeder in my backyard, but it's not that good because I had to yell," and something like that. I do it to something like that. I don't know the story in particular, but something to that effect. But
Thank you.
excellent. Thank you.
Okay, Thomas.
Sure. Johnny ran into my hostel room like a tornado, shouting, "Thomas, come with me!" And the tornado disappeared. I went out looking for him. What happened? Some gang war? No, no, I want you to run the 4 into 400 meters relay just now. Johnny. But tornado disappeared again.
Very good. Very, very good. You did all the things I would have asked you to do. The one thing I'll suggest is I attempt to eliminate all phrases that I have heard before. So like a tornado, I would switch to something else. I would fight for the new way to say like a tornado. So those cliches I try to strip. Now, admittedly, I tell people this all the time, and then they'll like pluck a story I have off the internet and go, "You used a cliche here." And I say, "Yeah, I know, I'm not perfect. I'm not happy about it either." Sometimes they slip out just because that's sort of what's at the top of your mind. But if you're crafting the story, I'd look to switch out the like a tornado. Otherwise, brilliant job. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bill?
My 90-year-old father has been reduced to an urn full of ashes. I'm sitting in a hotel room the night before the funeral. In walks my cousin John with my Uncle Henry and Aunt Ruth, also who had been reduced some years ago to urns full of ashes. John brought my aunt and uncle in to commune with my father.
Well, I'm not going to touch that one. That was beautiful.
That was actually the end of the story. I needed to start at the beginning and find a way to build it into a bigger story.
Oh, that's great. I love your beginning. I think it's fantastic. It's got surprise, it's got delight, it's got humor. Yes, I agree. That should be your new beginning. That's beautiful.
But I need a story to go with it now.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you have to ask yourself what that moment meant to you. How did it change you in some way and build it from there? Yeah, but excellent. Beautiful job.
Okay, the last one, Craig.
Okay, Matthew, so does this have to be true?
Well, my stories are true, but I mean, it sounds like you don't have a true one. So for the sake of time, give us your fiction.
So I'm the last man on earth. I'm sitting alone in my house. Suddenly there's a knock at the door.
Oh, well, there you go. That's the start of science fiction right there, or apocalyptic disaster. Yeah, I mean, excellent. Yes, it sounds like the beginning of a short story or a novel, and it's a good one. Yeah, very, very good. Excellent. Do you know what it is, by the way, that's knocking at the door, or or you just
No, that's the mystery.
We all want to.
All right,
You
very
can't
good.
start a story like that and just, no, I don't know.
Well, I write novels. I'm a fiction writer too, and I can tell you that as a fiction writer, it's very different than writing my personal stories. When I'm telling a story on stage, it's always a story about my life, and it's always true, and I know where it's going. When I write fiction, I start with a question like what you've just said, and I just start writing in some miraculous way. The stories sort of work themselves out. So I begin with that story and then just start writing and see what happens. About maybe like two-thirds of writers in the world write this way, which is we don't really know what we're doing. We start with a question and then we just start writing, and the story reveals itself to us as we write. There's really no planning or forethought. It took me a long time to figure that out because everyone who had ever taught me how to write fiction told me I had to plan it out. And it was only through a miracle that I discovered the way I can write and the way most writers write, which is we genuinely don't know what we're doing. I suspect that there's a lot of work being done unconsciously that is rising to the surface, making its way to our fingers and typing onto the computer. But yeah, see what you get from that. Just go from there and see if something happens. If you want to be a fiction writer. All right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matthew. Now
Yeah.
let's open up the floor for questions, and I'll go first. I have to ask you. Yeah, I guess your most famous story is This Is Going to Suck.
Yes.
And yeah, I love the stories about Charlie, the food throwing champion. And I love your story, Charity Thief. And I love pole vaulting, it's hilarious. But my favorite story is Walked Kaylee, 2 a.m., underwear, birds, rain, beauty. And I need to ask you, I have to ask you, what's your favorite story of Matthew Dix?
This is gonna not, you're not gonna love this answer, but my favorite story is always the story I am currently working on. You know, I am happy to tell stories that I have told before, but my joy is telling the new story. So it is always the one that I've crafted and have yet to tell someone, or the one I'm currently sort of mulling about in my head. Those tend to be my favorite stories. I am also predisposed to liking anything my wife likes. So if my wife says it's her favorite, then I like it a lot too, because my goal in life is to essentially please my wife. That is why I do most of what I do. Her favorite story is a story called Two Jewish Dicks. And it is sort of,
it's wonderful.
yes, and that is her favorite story. So I will say that it is not necessarily my favorite story, but it is her favorite story. So I have great affection for that one as well. Yes.
Yeah, this joke about green dicks, it's brilliant.
Yes. It is her cross to bear, for sure.
Yeah.
Although she's Jewish, so I don't know if cross to bear really is inappropriate. It's actually a cliche. I should not use it anyway.
No, you should use it. It's hilarious. Terry has a question. Terry, go ahead.
Well, I really appreciate it. I appreciated everything you've done this evening. It's been very interesting. You were just saying if you're going to write a novel, how you would set out. I'm going to start writing a true story that I've been wanting to work on for a long time. I'm at the point where I'm going to start working on it. And I can see where maybe starting with the end in mind or something like that might be a better approach to it. Do you have any suggestions on that?
When I start telling a true story, I almost always have a good understanding of where I'm going to end because that informs where I'm going to begin. The two should be in opposition to each other. So
Okay.
whatever resolution is going to come at the end, you should be asking yourself, what was the opposite of having that resolution or having that realization or transformation? John Updike said that he knew the last sentence of every novel he ever wrote. I think that's taking it to an extreme, but he's John Updike and I'm just Matthew Dix. So maybe if I was a better writer, I could pull that off too. I do think that when it comes to true stories, if you understand the end, the roadmap becomes a lot clearer. You know what to include and what not to include. So, yeah, I would be thinking in those terms. I'll also tell you, this does not relate to your question, but advice is you don't necessarily need to write it in order. I tell writers all the time, like, write the thing that you're most interested in. So, you might write the first chapter and then not want to write the second chapter because it feels hard. Well, skip it then. Wait for a day when it's raining out and you want to beat yourself up in a little harsher way and then write that one. So don't be afraid to write things completely out of order and then assemble them in the end. The goal is to assemble as many sentences as possible over the course of a day. And if that means you write chapter 17 before you write chapter 3, there's nothing wrong with that at all.
And would you still use like that, like letting itself kind of write itself as you're not knowing what's coming out as you're working along with it?
No, well, that only applies to my fiction. When
Okay.
I'm writing nonfiction,
You already know the story. Gotcha.
I kind of know it. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean things don't surprise me and that I
Right.
don't go, oh, wow, I should include that. Or, oh, I forgot about that. There are moments of surprise, but the path is kind of clear. I mean, I'm working on a solo show right now, which is me standing on stage and speaking for 90 minutes. I don't write anything down that I ever speak on stage ever. I hold it in my head. But if we're going to think about me crafting it in my head, I know the last scene, I know the opening scene, and I think I know all the scenes that are going to get me there. But I know as I do that, something will pop up and surprise me along the way. But I pretty much have the path laid out already. So I would suggest that for you.
Thank you.
Yep. Best of luck.
Okay, and then the next question is from the guest whose name I'm quite challenged to pronounce. Okay, go ahead.
Do you mean Jim?
Yeah, thanks.
Jim. Jim. Okay.
Sometimes when I'm watching a movie, a suspenseful movie, there'll be a glancing shot of, for example, an axe. And later, a few scenes later, that axe becomes something important. Do you think that's a good technique to use in storytelling? And how can I do something like a glancing shot of something in a storytelling?
I'm not a fan of the foreshadow, which is what sort of you're describing. But what I am a fan of is surprise. So oftentimes, surprise is predicated on the idea that we have to lay clues or information out in a story. And oftentimes, for the surprise to work, the audience can't recognize the importance of the information. You have to tell them something, make sure it's in their heads, but then make it feel unimportant so that it can be surprising later on. And so there's lots of techniques to do that. I could go on forever about it because it's one of the trickiest and most delightful things we can offer to an audience. It's why movies like The Sixth Sense and The Usual Suspects and Seven, these are movies that stick with us because the endings are so surprising, and surprise happens to be very memorable to people. It creates great memories. So I wouldn't do what you described, which is sort of place an object earlier as a means of foreshadowing. But I would say if there's an axe that's going to be relevant, we should at least know that axe exists in some way, unless it's going to naturally appear later on. If you know about Chekhov's gun, it's a belief that like if you show a gun in the first act of a play, it better fire by the third act, or everyone's going to be frustrated with you, right? So there is purpose to what we talk about and what we show. So that axe that you've mentioned, if I'm going to naturally stumble upon it over the course of the story, allow me to naturally stumble upon it. I'm not going to stumble upon it, but I need to know of its existence, I would mention it early in the story, but I'd hide it as best as I could. I'd put it in a list of other things. I'd make it funny. I'd try to make it so that the audience does not recognize the axe as being important, just that it exists. It's very tricky to pull these things off. It is the thing that requires the most effort in storytelling, I think, is to preserve, expand, and then sort of like pull off the surprise. But when you do it, it's the best thing you can do for an audience. I love it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, 3 more questions. Crystal, you have a question.
My question is, can you suggest some ways to include humor into your stories, please?
Yeah. Be funny. That's a good start. A few easy humor strategies. I like to give people humor strategies that sort of work even if they end up not producing a laugh. The problem with humor is when people aren't funny, they tend to feel dumb. Like the joke didn't play off and then they feel stupid. But there are versions of humor that you can do where if it doesn't work, it's still okay. Nostalgia is the easiest one. Nostalgia makes people laugh because they laugh at the weird way we once lived compared to today. But if it doesn't produce a laugh, it's still illustrating what the past is like. So if I tell you that, in the 1980s, the primary means of finding a job was you would sit on your front stoop and wait for a 16-year-old kid to ride by on a bike and throw a piece of paper at you or a collections of papers. It's a newspaper, which was in the 1980s essentially the internet. And in that newspaper contained all the job possibilities of your life, because every job was geographically bound to a certain location, and quite literally it was delivered by a teenager maybe once a day, right? So that might make people laugh, but even if it doesn't make people laugh, it's an indication of what the past was like. So that's an easy way to make people laugh. Another way an easy way to make people laugh is to just exaggerate in a way that they understand you're exaggerating. So if I say to you, well, my wife is Jewish, but we celebrate Christmas, and she was very excited about doing so. And I let her buy the first Christmas tree 19 years ago. She picked it out. And I called it the wild one. It was the kind of tree that only a Jewish woman would buy. And I say it was 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall. It was essentially a rectangle of a tree. That's not actually its dimensions. That's an exaggeration of the dimensions. It might make people laugh, but even if it doesn't, it illustrates a point that it was an irregularly shaped tree. So exaggeration and nostalgia are two ways to be funny, but if your joke doesn't work, people will still feel like you're making a point, as opposed to some of the other humor strategies, which are clearly jokes, which if they fall flat, you might feel foolish. So those are two easy ways to do it. I tend to tell people, though, in storytelling, we're not funny for the sake of being funny. I can make many things funny. I do stand-up comedy. I can make a lot of things funny very easily, but I don't do that in storytelling. Instead, I'm strategically funny. I'm funny at the beginning of a story to convince people that I have intelligence and you should listen to me. I'm funny right before something terrible happens because it makes the terrible thing hurt more. And I'm funny right after a terrible thing has happened because the audience often needs to take a breath. They need a moment to collect themselves, and a laugh is a good way to do it. So we're not looking to be funny just because we can be. We're looking to be funny because an audience needs it at particular times in a story. If you're doing stand-up, I recommend you try to be funny as often as possible. It's also one of the most horrendous things you can do, which is why I do it all the time. I believe in doing things that frighten you, and stand-up frightened the hell out of me, which is why I agreed to do it. I still do it to this day. It doesn't frighten me anymore, but I can tell you it's a difficult thing to do, which is why you probably should give it a try at some time. And once you do stand-up, everything else in life is easier, I promise you. So hopefully that helps.
Yes.
Nostalgia and exaggeration. Those are two easy ways to do it.
Okay, Bill, go ahead. Two more questions.
I'm sorry, I'm here.
Hi, Bill.
Hi. You mentioned that you don't want to start with a exposition. I get that.
Yeah.
Somewhere in my stories, I always find myself wanting to provide flowery descriptions of the place I'm at.
Yeah.
Is that within your wheelhouse, or is that something you avoid?
I think the pronoun that you used is really interesting. At some point in the story, I want to provide flowery descriptions of the place. I agree that you want to do that, but I can tell you that 99% of all audiences never want flowery descriptions of locations.
Notwithstanding
It's what you want.
Success of James Michener.
Yeah, right. So, but that's different for a book, though, because if you grab one of my novels, you'll find I describe things all the time because that's a different format, right? Now you're committing 8 to 12 hours of your life and you want a fully realized environment. But when you're telling an oral story, a story has never ended in the history of the planet, and a story hasn't ended and the audience said, "Boy, I wish she had described more stuff," right? That never has happened. No one's ever finished a story and said, I wish I knew what color eyes she had," or "Boy, I wish what hue of green the grass was," right? Nobody.
Well, let me just cut to the chase here with an example. How do you describe Norway without describing Norway? The hill, snow.
Well, Norway, your story is not taking place across all of Norway. Where is it taking place in Norway?
Well, in Oslo, where, for example, each street with a hill on it has a ski jump.
Yeah, and is that relevant to the story?
It makes it an interesting place.
So it's not relevant to the story. Again, what you're saying is, I would like to tell people that streets in Oslo also have a ski jump, right? But if it's not actually going to pertain to the story, I say it has to go away.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'll have to think about that. I understand
Yeah.
your perspective. I'm not sure I fully agree with it, but we might be on talking about different kinds of speeches. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, the one thing I will say that I think we both can agree to is there is always a difference between what a speaker wants to say and what an audience wants. And the more a speaker can submit to the wants of the audience as opposed to their own wants, myself too included, Bill, I am always predisposed to be funny. And early on in my storytelling career, I would be telling a story to my wife, and she would say, "That was great, but what was the 30 seconds on the Pop Tarts about?" And I'd say, "It was funny." And she said, "Absolutely, it was hilarious, but it did not help you get to the end of your story." And so I had to learn that, like, my desire to make people laugh, because when you laugh, I feel better about myself. It is my drug. I had to recognize that the audience actually doesn't want to laugh the whole time. So for all of us, we have to remember the key question we should ask ourselves is, what does the audience actually want from us as opposed to what we might want to say? Those two things are different most of the time, unfortunately. But that's why we have spouses and children. They are subjected to all of the things we want to say, regardless of what they want to actually hear. That's why you marry people and have kids. Yeah. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, Alex, you have a question.
Thanks. Yes, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have a great deal of respect and a great deal of gratitude for you for coming here and sharing all of these insights with us. Very, very witty, very wise. One thing that I'd like to know is that I'm going over the various like really compelling speeches, and there's sort of the link, the story link. How do we develop that story link? Is it through a specific image that goes through the story, a specific wording, something? I like the fact that you talk about trimming as many adverbs and adjectives as possible. I really agree with that because objects are vivid.
Yeah.
Adjectives are not. Anyway, I'm going to go off onto a great diatribe, but I would like you perhaps to share some of your insights with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Alex, I actually agree with what you said. The link that between sort of the story and the idea we're trying to share, we make it through language, we make it through image. The important thing is that we link it. My friend who did the the two scooter riders, right? The one thing I had to adjust his story and suggest was he had to keep saying, just like my daughter had an aggressive but cautious approach, so will we. And that was the way he was going to link it, right? Sometimes we link it with dialogue. Someone says something in a story, and we want that bit of dialogue to be the conveyor to the idea. So we're going to come back to that dialogue all the time. But the important thing is we don't want to just come back to it once because it doesn't make the story feel important enough. We want to come back to it at least 2 or 3 times. So when we pivot to the idea, we're going to bring that story over at least 2 or 3 times along the way to reinforce the idea that that story is still super relevant to what we're talking about. I always believe that when you can bring something from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, it makes the audience feel like everything you said along the way was greatly relevant. Because, wow, something he said in the first 30 seconds of the story actually became relevant at the end of the story. Everything here was crafted finely for me. And that gives that audience that feel that they really heard something, not just a collection of ideas, but a well-rounded, bit of brilliance. So what you said, I think, is absolutely true. I would do it the way you described it.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Yep. Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the kind words. Thank you.
We have 2 more minutes to wrap it up. And I have the very last question. Very short and short answer. You can answer in 1 word. How does it feel to have your own Wikipedia page?
It's funny. I mean, it's not something I think about very often. I can tell you that one of the things about my Wikipedia page is my students, some of them have learned how to edit Wikipedia pages. And so my age is often, I think I was like 1,012 years old recently because one of my students decided to, create problems for me. I don't know. I don't think it's that hard to have a Wikipedia page. I think someone has to just decide that you're important enough to have a Wikipedia page. I mean, I've never made one, but I don't think it's that hard. So, So I honestly haven't put a lot of thought into it. I tend to be a person, this is going to sound silly, but it's true. I am, my wife said this about me yesterday. She said, Matt is the best compartmentalizer I've ever met. And she was saying that to describe sort of when I come home from teaching, every single thing that happened in the classroom is now behind me until I return to the classroom tomorrow. My wife comes home dragging every child she teaches into our dining room, and I have to hear about it at the dinner table every night. And she suffers over these children. I suffer over them until 3:20. And then there's no point in me suffering over them anymore until 8:30 the next morning. And so, in that same way, the idea that I have a Wikipedia page, it's a compartmentalized idea that I don't put any thought into at all. I'm always thinking about the next thing. I'm always focused on sort of the horizon and the next step forward I'm going to take. So, it's probably a dumb answer, but I honestly don't think about it at all, other than when my students hack my Wikipedia page and then send me an email laughing at what they've just done to me. I don't actually know how to fix the Wikipedia page either, but there are Wikipedia editors who seem to pick up these mistakes pretty quickly and go and fix them for me. So I am appreciative of the fact that Wikipedia has some standards and some people paying attention to the standards. But yeah, I don't think about it.
But I think you have quite a few hours to write anything you want to write in Wikipedia page until it's gonna be fixed. Okay, and it's a great skill to leave everything behind and to move on, because it's dragging and dragging and dragging, and we are just wasting our energy. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, for being here, for sharing your insights. Really, it's always a great pleasure of mine to see you, to hear you. Your stories, it's a great pleasure for me. Sometimes I just watch YouTube, you presenting your stories, and it's a great feeling to hear your story. Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. We're gonna wrap it up because it's already 8:31 and we're letting you go. Thank you, Matthew. If you have something to say, go ahead.
No, I appreciate all of you. You're doing the thing that frightens people the most, which is public speaking. So congratulations. You're better than most people. It's a good feeling to have, to know that you're better than everyone else. So congratulations on being better than everyone else. I hope our paths cross at some point. If you want to reach out to me, just MatthewDix.com or Storyworthy.com. You can come find me there, and perhaps I'll see you on the internets or maybe even in real life someday. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, everyone. And with that, I'm turning it over to our presiding officer.